I've officially wasted almost half of my life on this stupid bear. So, Five Nights at Freddy's turns 10 this week, and saying it's been a crazy week would be an understatement. In the span of like 8 days, we've gotten spin-off demos, free novels, a bunch of announcements, and the entire next game? Yeah, they're literally just dropping a full game on August 8th, only a few months after announcing it, and even though we knew that was happening well in advance, it still took me a bit to stop wondering if I fell into a time warp to 2015 or something. I guess the same thing pretty much happened with Help Wanted 2, so who knows, maybe this is just going to be a regular thing again. I haven't actually gotten to play Into the Pit yet on account of it's not out while I'm making this video and I'm not famous enough to get an early copy, but if it's anything like how the trailers have made it seem, it looks like a wonderful game and I can't wait to get my hands on it. I'm actively excited to play the next FNaF game, which is a very odd feeling that I haven't experienced in almost 3 years until now. On a completely unrelated note, can you believe Security Breach is almost 3 years old now? The time sure flies, doesn't it? What I'm trying to say is that after a few years of going into everything FNaF related with a very skeptical outlook and being pleasantly surprised every time, I'm finally at the point where I can say that I like modern FNaF overall, and I think it's a perfectly acceptable direction for the franchise to go in. That's a pretty controversial opinion at the moment, so I thought it'd be fun to talk about how I reached it and analyze some of the most common criticisms of recent entries, many of which I think are more than fair, and many of which I think are jarringly biased narratives that fundamentally misunderstand the entire series. Here's the central question that's been on my mind a lot lately. What makes FNaF special? FNaF is a survival horror game where you fend off killer animatronics using various tools until you either complete some type of goal or you get jump scared. And that's all that's required for a mainline FNaF game to be a mainline FNaF game. That's how I would describe it to someone who's never heard of it before, but that's boring. That's what made me vaguely curious enough to do a quick Google search in 2014, not what made me obsessed with it for years. It was the addictive gameplay loop, captivating story, and dark atmosphere that got me hooked, and thankfully not only have those things been taking center stage again recently, but I'd argue they might have even been improved in some areas. Like I said, this might be a controversial one. Let's start with the gameplay because it's both the least subjective thing on the list and probably the easiest to defend. There's a fairly common narrative that old FNaF was all about staying put, managing resources, and trying to make it to 6 AM. Until Steelwool came along and turned it into generic free-roam fetch quest simulators with bad stealth mechanics, completely sacrificing everything that made it unique. I can only assume people who say this also respond to Breaking Bad versus Game of Thrones debates by skipping to the final season of both and then asking how anyone ever thought they were even remotely on the same level. This is not a comparison of classic and modern FNaF. It is a comparison of FNaF 1 and Security Breach. Sister Location was also an objective-based free-roam game with stealth sections, and almost every level in the Help Wanted games has sit and survive or resource management elements. Even Security Breach has a few time-based office segments. Yes, they completely suck, but it's not the first time that's happened. The only actual consistent change is the engine the games are made in. FNaF's signature gameplay loop never required you to be stationary, have to manage any resources, or even be in an office. All of these rules were broken by the 4th game when Steelwool was still making Mars Odyssey. If you're in a fairly small location, repeatedly using a few tools to stop animatronics from getting to you until you win, it can be a traditional FNaF game. The majority of Help Wanted 1 and 2 follow that formula, and so does The Joy of Creation, which is an official spin-off now and just released a demo, so I'm not sure where the idea that the classic style was abandoned just because those games are 3D came from. New gameplay styles are being experimented with, but we've actually gotten more traditional FNaF gameplay than non-traditional so far since 2019. Aside from that, I think it's entirely possible to experiment with non-traditional gameplay styles without losing the spirit of FNaF, and that it's a very healthy thing for the franchise. First of all, like I've already mentioned, branching out gameplay-wise is nothing new for this series, and is actually a big reason it's been able to stay relevant for so long. FNaF 4 got rid of cameras entirely, and it was still being called stale by a lot of people on release. Sister Location's main game throughout the entire formula and was praised for breathing new life into the series just as it was getting old. And it's always been fascinating to me how much most Click Team purists hype up Pizzeria Simulator when the gameplay supposedly needed to be a FNaF game is just 1/3 of the experience and you spend more time playing minigames in the Tycoon segment than dealing with the animatronics. Now, I love all of those games, and so does most of the community. So where did this rigid mindset of what FNAF's gameplay has to be come from? I think a lot of fans wanted to critique Security Breach, but didn't know how to specifically articulate everything they hated about it. So they found it easier to just latch onto it being different than all the previous games. And since there was a lot of uncertainty over the direction the series was taking, the dominant narrative became that Security Breach was bad because it was different, old FNAF was dead, and every new game would be like Security Breach. To be perfectly clear, I don't plan on defending Security Breach's gameplay at all because there's nothing worth defending. It is essentially a glorified walking simulator with some puzzles and a few chase sequences, and while I'm able to enjoy the game personally, it still has the same gameplay loop as Garten of Banban. Security Breach isn't bad because it's a non-traditional FNAF game, it's bad because it sucks. It's riddled with fundamental game design issues all the way down, and you'll have a much more effective argument to make if you focus on attacking it for those issues, rather than for not conforming to your personal idea of what a FNAF game should be when half of the original series also doesn't. If you like any FNAF game after 3, criticizing the series for branching out is a lazy and hypocritical argument, and you can do so much better. Critiquing the new gameplay is a strong case. Criticizing the fact that it's new gameplay is absolute nonsense. Overall, I think FNAF honestly picked the perfect time to get experimental. The general attitude toward the series in 2015 was that a brilliant and unique concept was starting to feel more gimmicky and diluted with every repeat, and it needed to either try something different or quit while it was ahead. If you've played anywhere near as many fan games as I have, you'll know that there's only a few more times the original formula could have been done before it ran out of good mechanics and started to get really annoying. Trust me, you would have hated getting 10 more entries just like the first 3. Some will probably say that that's proof that FNAF should have ended with 3, but I don't know. We've gotten some really great games since then, and I think there's plenty of angles that haven't been explored yet. Of course, it's not usually the gameplay that's cited as the reason this franchise should have ended a while back. FNAF's lore and storytelling is arguably the biggest reason it blew up on the internet and stuck around longer than any other trend. The Let's Plays and scare compilations were huge, but theory videos about the mysterious narrative of the early games were what really gave it its staying power. There's still plenty of popular theorists around today, many of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting, but it feels like large portions of the community are much less enthusiastic than they used to be, or have given up on the lore entirely. Considering this was my immediate reaction to Ruin last year, I know the feeling. Now that I've had more time to think on it though, and put the pieces together, I actually think this is the best state FNAF's story has been in for a long time, and I'm totally serious about that. Has the narrative actually gotten worse, or have many longtime fans just been looking at it with the wrong tools? Let me explain. During the early days, FNAF lore quickly became notorious for being very, almost frustratingly vague. Every game opened up more questions than it answered. The answers we were given were presented through 8-bit minigames and rare Easter eggs, and they were almost always open to interpretation. It wasn't clear storytelling, but that was a big part of the fun, because we knew the next game would answer some questions we'd been asking for months, and then give us all new mysteries to think about. It was messy, and sometimes just plain incoherent, but things ended up mostly making sense in the end. Our heroes completed their mission, the last remnants of the nightmare burned, and the killer was condemned to suffer for a long, long time. It's a pretty satisfying story. Or at least it was, until Help Wanted revealed that William Afton had somehow returned as Glitch Trap, eventually became Bird Trap in Security Breach, and was fought in the ruins of the FNAF 6 pizzeria before being killed once again until he inevitably comes back as Trap in FNAF 27 and further destroys any meaning behind Henry's sacrifice, right? Except that's not what happened at all. Ruin revealed that Afton really was dead and gone, and that our new antagonist, the Mimic, had been imitating bits of behavior it learned from Afton to start a new killing spree and escape its prison under the Pizzaplex. Not only that, but it turns out Bird Trap was never canonically fought to begin with, or supposed to move, apparently. Considering most of this fandom had spent the last 4 years complaining that Afton's return ruined FNAF 6's ending and the series needed a new antagonist, they must have been overjoyed their wish came true, right? Nope, a ton of people called it a lazy retcon that Steelwool threw in at the last minute because of the backlash they got from Security Breach. Ignoring the fact, by the way, that Tales from the Pizzaplex, the books that introduced the Mimic, started production in 2019, and also ignoring that a ton of things in Help Wanted clearly point to Glitchtrap being the Mimic in hindsight, like being able to perfectly imitate Tape Girl's voice to lure Vanessa into becoming infected. This is something that really annoys me, so apologies if this starts to turn into a bit of an angry rant, but a lot of this fandom desperately needs to learn the difference between a retcon and a plot twist, and this is a great example of why. A retcon is when something previously established by the narrative is later changed, contradicted, or outright ignored. Glitchtrap and Burntrap being Afton was never established by the narrative, it was just the most likely theory at the time and turned out to be wrong. Just like Michael Afton was widely assumed to be Springtrap after Sister Location came out, and that whole mess had to be debunked by Pizzeria Simulator. What you were looking at back then, and what you're still looking at now, is an unfinished story. There's going to be things that don't entirely make sense, there's going to be characters that haven't been fully explored, and there's going to be crucial plot points that haven't been shown yet. Just like there always was before the original narrative was wrapped up by FNaF 6 and Ultimate Custom Night. It seems like a lot of fans suddenly forgot how the storyline has always worked when the Click Team era ended, and it's led to a lot of prominent criticisms that were never considered an issue until the last few years. We don't know enough about the Mimic in its first appearance, even though William Afton was introduced in FNaF 2 without a single confirmed fact about him. Everything is too sci-fi now, even though FNaF 2 had hyper-advanced robots with AI facial recognition tied to a massive criminal database in 1987. Too much of the story is conveyed through the books now, but we wouldn't even know Henry and Charlie's names if not for the novel trilogy. These aren't necessarily bad or wrong criticisms, but they're very rarely applied evenly across the franchise. I also don't think the argument that the books are required to understand the story is a particularly strong one in general, since only a few stories contain major lore content, all of which has either already been revealed in the games or will be later on. Again, this is an unfinished story and the books have always been a glimpse of what's to come. Just look at Silver Eyes and Sister Location. There also seems to be a strong sentiment that FNAF's story is stuck in the past, constantly revisiting old characters, locations, and events without being able to move on to something fresh. I genuinely have no idea where this came from, aside from when we thought Afton was back, which we now know isn't true, and the fact that the FNAF 6 pizzeria has been revisited a few times now, even though they find something totally unique to do with the setting every time we see it. We haven't seen a single appearance from Michael, Henry, William, Elizabeth, or Charlie since UCN, and the focus has been entirely on a new cast of protagonists since Help Wanted. The story being told here is about the aftermath of the previous one, showing how the legacy of William's crimes and Fazbear Entertainment's loose ends are still affecting people. The Mimic exists as it does because of Fazbear Entertainment's habit of covering up anything that goes wrong. The Yellow Rabbit is a living amalgamation of the vague memories and jumbled theories spawned from the Missing Children incident. It doesn't feel like an override of FNAF 6's ending anymore, but rather a look at how the events of those games would have affected this universe after it was all said and done. Speaking of, I also wanted to quickly talk about the new cast a bit, since they're often considered to not be as interesting or well-written as the older characters. I think this is a fair take to a point, since Vanessa's arc was botched pretty terribly, and Security Breach does an awful job of conveying Gregory's motives, but it tends to be applied too broadly and in some really strange ways. First, it's hard to compare the old and new characters at all, because the older games didn't really have characters for a while. Phone Guy and Phone Dude are the only humans with any dialogue in the first 3 games, and even though we now know we're playing as Michael Afton in FNAF 1 and possibly 3, that doesn't help much either. Michael has a single speech at the end of Sister Location and a few inferred characteristics from FNAF 6 in the logbook, and that's it. He's a mostly blank slate with only a few things about him ever hinted at, and I think the fandom got so caught up in running with their detailed interpretation of him that they forgot just how little about him is actually known. He really is a very muddy protagonist who's hard to interpret sometimes, and the community mostly had to write him themselves. It's easy to like your headcanons of Michael, but it's hard to like the character itself, because he barely is a character. Gregory and Cassie have definitely not been fully explored yet, but they do have distinct personalities and defined histories that aren't left totally blank for large amounts of time, and I'm excited to see what can be done with them when they're more fleshed out. I seriously can't help but wonder sometimes if people instinctively dumb down these characters just because they're children and Michael's an adult, even though we already know way more about them both after 2 games than we did about Mike after 7. As for the antagonists, I strongly prefer William, and he's a much more interesting character to me so far, but I'm not sure how the living emotional consequence of a man's grief and anger representing a cycle of abuse is an inherently worse or more generic villain than a child murderer trying to become immortal. I wouldn't write off the Mimic so quickly when we've only seen brief appearances from it so far, and it took Afton a while to become such an iconic threat. Remember, story in progress, let's see how it pans out. Gameplay and story might be the 2 things that made FNaF the juggernaut it is today, but they aren't the most important things to everyone. For many people, the soul of the series has always been its atmosphere, tone, and the themes it tackles. I'm one of those people, and I'm glad to say that for the most part, I think it's alive and well. FNaF has always occupied a certain niche in the horror genre where it zigzags just how dark it gets. One moment, a serial killer is getting skewered alive by the ghosts of his victims in a mechanical prison of his own design and left to rot there, unable to move for 30 years. And then Freddy Fazbear is exploring space for the 3rd time. It built a reputation for being very kid-friendly on the surface while having incredibly violent and disturbing lore if you read between the lines, and that turned out to be such a successful formula that it spawned an entire subgenre that has arguably dominated horror games for most of a decade. There's a very common belief that FNaF has mostly abandoned its horror roots nowadays and is a lot more kid-friendly than it used to be, and again, no, that's just Security Breach. First things first, FNaF never relied on explicit violence, and part of the reason it was so successful was offering a more subtle alternative to ultra-gory horror that was popular at the time, like Resident Evil and Outlast. Creepy game over screens and Atari minigames are the most overtly graphic the games have ever been, so complaining that the new games lack brutal kills is a completely nonsensical thing to be upset about. There are some absolutely sick moments in the books though, so I would definitely recommend those if I thought anyone making this argument could read. Most people who feel the newer games aren't dark enough are talking about the tone and not the gore. I just wanted to have a bit of fun. Still, I don't think the atmosphere or themes have gotten any lighter, and this is largely another example of misinterpreting both the classic and modern games, along with conflating the worst moments in Security Breach with the overall narrative. Yes, it is very pathetic that Sony wouldn't let Glamrock Freddy mention blood. It doesn't mean the franchise is for infants now when you have an overarching storyline about abuse, trauma, and guilt going on in the background. The Mimic was just a helpful robot until it was shown hatred and anger by a human, and as a result, 2 of our protagonists have been mind-controlled into killing people they cared about, a 3rd is trapped who knows where, thinking her best friend betrayed her, and that's not even mentioning the countless tragedies and frights and tales. Bright colors and friendly animatronics aside, the lore is as dark as it's ever been, and it takes one hell of a bias to think the game that had this in it was less goofy. It's not just in the background either. There are several specific moments that are extremely unsettling to experience and have a really eerie atmosphere. The entirety of Pizza Party is a surreal, feverish hellscape and ends with you experiencing what Afton's victims felt firsthand. The first time you take off the mask in Help Wanted 2 leads to the strange realization that the bright hub world you've been seeing is entirely fake, and you're really all alone in a dark, decrepit, and incredibly creepy sinkhole with a shapeshifter who could be anywhere. The Brazil ending has Cassie stuck in a dead end, retreating into a fantasy world she knows isn't real as the Mimic breathes down her neck, ready to tear her limb from limb. Besides these standout highlight moments, the games still have really solid atmosphere when they're trying to be scary. Help Wanted 1 and 2 have some terrifying levels in super creepy hub worlds, and Ruin has a pretty oppressive atmosphere all throughout, especially when you finally get to the sinkhole. If you don't believe me, try playing through the job interview level in VR. I think my soul left my body the first time Baby walked up to a door, and that's good enough to prove to me that FNaF still got it. Look, despite everything I've said in this video, I understand why some people have a hard time getting on board with the newer entries. The series does feel different now than it did back then, because it's a new era. There's absolutely nothing wrong with just not feeling a connection with the new story, the way 3D gameplay works with the series, or the themes that are being tackled now. But if you're gonna try to actually critique specific things, you should be aware of your own biases and try not to cherry pick. There are plenty of legitimate concerns about the series lately, a few of which I was able to cover in this video, and most of which I couldn't. But when the dominant argument can be boiled down to new thing bad, old thing good, with little to no nuance, those legitimate criticisms get buried under all the noise and tainted by association. Try looking at things from a different perspective, and consider if your points really are hard to shoot down, or if you've just normalized them to the point you assume no one will. This video could certainly be improved, and I think you could craft a pretty convincing counter-argument against it, so have at it. If I'm lucky though, maybe I've managed to convince a few of you that it's not quite as bleak as it might seem, and some things may not have changed as much as you'd think. I will never be obsessed with FNaF like I was in the mid-2010s again, and that's okay. This anniversary week was big enough to spark my passion for the franchise again for a little while, and I'm just really enjoying the ride before it starts to fizzle out again. Something I realized at the end of last year is maybe the games didn't necessarily get worse, and I just lost my drive to keep up with them the way I used to. Now when I see someone talking about how Steel Wool's forever broken the series beyond repair, I wonder if they really do miss the old FNaF, or if they miss how they felt 7, 8, 9, or 10 years ago when they were playing it. I've met plenty of both, but I know what the answer is for me, and accepting that has finally allowed me to casually appreciate the new stuff for what it is, without expecting to fall into a time-traveling ball pit of my own anytime soon. Happy anniversary, y'all. Hope everyone's excited to play Into the Pit tomorrow, because I sure am. I think it'll be awesome, but I also think it'd be hysterically funny if the game comes out and just completely sucks beyond all belief, like way worse than anything else in the series after I just spent over 20 minutes telling you should be excited for the future. So I'm not sure which outcome to root for. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll do my best to upload again within the next, year, probably. Like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter, yada yada yada. Catch you next time.